The idea that all consumers are rational and that each of us thinks and chooses unfailingly well is disappearing. There are many examples of human behavior which raise serious questions about the rationality of many judgments and decisions that people make. How can regulators and market authorities change consumer behavior in order to realize the desired market outcome? What can be learned from behavioral economics? The best innovation, according to our next speaker, the MacBook Air.
Your Majesty, honored guests, attendees who got here, notwithstanding train problems, it's a great honor, really, to be here. I want to tell you a little story which will organize some of these somewhat academic remarks. During World War II, there were a number of American pilots who were crashing their planes on landing back in American territory. Why were the American pilots crashing their planes not in the midst of, combat, but as they were returning? This was a problem. Some of them had serious injuries, and the planes got hurt badly. And the American military decided to enlist a psychologist to figure out what was going on in their heads. And the idea was there was some problem with the American pilots. They were stressed out, maybe. They were tired. There was something about the circumstances of war that had gotten to them, and there was some psychological problem that needed to be handled. The psychologist discovered shortly that there were only a subset of American pilots who were crashing the planes. They were the bombers, which gave a clue that maybe the bomber pilots had a particular problem, and the psychologist wanted to figure that out. But there was nothing discernible with the bombers' psychology that suggested why they should be crashing the plane. Now, from the standpoint of traditional regulatory thinking, we'd be focused on incentives, I think, and the idea would be, is there some problem with the incentives of American bombers such that they were being reckless? It's hard to think what would be the incentive problem. A pilot doesn't want to risk his life or crash a plane, so that seemed to be a bit of a dead end. So the psychologist effort and the economist effort both were unproductive. And what the psychologist figured out was there's something distinctive about the bombers' planes. That is, in those planes, the cockpits are designed in the following way. The lever that you're supposed to use to land the plane properly in the bomber plane is adjacent to another lever which looks identical to it, which you're not supposed to use when you're landing the plane. This was not a problem of poor incentives, nor was it a problem of bomber psychology. It was a problem of poor cockpit design. And that is an insight into what we should call, I think, choice architecture as an ingredient of consumer and business behavior. And one way to organize these remarks is to say what we need to be doing in the regulatory domain is to be thinking frequently whether the problem might not be cockpit design, not a problem of poor incentives or of some sort of psychological problem that's being faced by consumers or businesses. Okay. The clicker isn't clicking. This is an illustration of inadequate cockpit design. I hope you enjoyed it more than I did. Okay, so from 1960 to 2000, with us today are a few ideas about human behavior. There's an assumption that people are essentially rational, which is to say that they maximize their own ends. They calculate probabilities and maximize expected value. So whether a consumer is rich or poor, struggling with financial difficulty or not, there's a calculation engaged. They are highly responsive to incentives. The initial allocation of the entitlement doesn't matter. That's a little technical, and I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. And the policy prescription is to correct market failures and to improve incentives. I think that way of thinking has organized much of regulatory practice for the last 50, 60 years. Okay, the behavioral revolution, as we might call it, acknowledges and emphasizes the existence of standard market failures. So in the case of monopolies or externalities or information failure, certainly a problem that the United Nations is focusing on in the financial context, there's a market failure that needs to be addressed. The behavioral claim is that we're dealing with Homo sapiens, not Homo economicus. And that is to say that there are behavioral market failures that complement the list. So Homo sapiens is subject to certain fallibility that Homo economicus is not. So to make a little illustration of this, why don't you, if you're willing to indulge me, think about yourself for a moment. Let's have a narcissistic moment. Now, if you did indulge me in that moment, for everyone in the room, a certain part of the brain lit up. An identifiable part of your brain lit up when you thought about yourself. That's locatable. Now, if you would, think about yourself on a beach a year from now. For a certain number of you, when you thought about yourself on the beach a year from now, that part of the brain lit up again. But for a certain number of you, it didn't. What's important about that is that for those of you for whom that part of the brain did not light up when you thought about yourself a year from now, you have a greater likelihood of being concerned about the short term and not the long term, of focusing on your immediate economic and other prospects and not your long-term prospects. This is what behavioral economists call present bias, and it can get consumers, poor consumers in particular, but not only poor, into terrible trouble. We know also that human beings are prone to optimistic bias. That is to say that 80% of people think that they are better than the average driver and less likely to be involved in a serious accident. 94% of professors think that they're better than the average college professor. And in some studies, 100% of people upon getting married believe that they are not going to get divorced, even though they have a sense of the statistical reality. Optimistic bias combined with present bias can create terrible difficulties. We know, too, that human beings are subject to inertia, that changing from a status quo is often very difficult, even when the economic and emotional costs of doing so are quite low. That means that people tend often to be stuck in a social context which it is economically and otherwise possible to get out of. One concrete application is there's often insufficient take-up of desirable programs that small businesses and individuals can benefit from. This is a terrible problem in poor nations, but it's also a problem in wealthy nations. Another problem is that switching behavior from one set of outcomes to another, or one set of relationships to another, is sometimes very hard to get motivated, even when switching behavior is very much in the interest of the consumer or the business to do. Okay, here are some behavioral policy claims emphasized over the last 15 years or so. Default rules really matter. That is to say, the rule that establishes what happens if people do nothing tends to be immensely important, far more than standard economics suggests. So you have on your cell phone or your tablet or your computer a large number of default rules which establish settings if you do nothing. Some of them involve privacy. For the average person, the default rule tends to be very sticky. That is, they're most unlikely to change it. Default rules are like cockpits. They don't come from nature or the sky. They're designed by someone, and they greatly matter to social outcomes. The World Bank is doing a report for 2015 on development. Its focus is on behavioral science, and one of its principal emphases is on the immense importance in establishing default rules that are helpful. We know that incentives may not matter that much if people don't know what they are. So notwithstanding the conventional regulatory prescription, which is, in brief, incentives, 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 if people don't know what the incentives are, they won't matter much. Choice architecture, as in the case of the cockpit, is exceedingly important, and it's not avoidable. Often it's invisible to consumers and businesses, but it's nonetheless there. Here's a little story from an American novelist, David Foster Wallace. There are two fish, young fish, swimming in the ocean. An old fish comes by them and says, "Hi boys, how's the water?" After the old fish passes them, one young fish says to the other young fish, "What's water?" It's a profound story, I think, because we're often swimming in things whose name and content we take for granted. People can use a nudge in the sense that there's often choice architecture behind their decisions that's not helpful, and simplicity is very important. Simpler is not the worst mantra for private and public sectors. Wherever things are, to make them a notch simpler is usually in the interest of relevant people. Okay, there's a large number of areas where the behavioral revolution matters, ranging from consumer protection to energy efficiency to competition policy to healthcare. Now, to get a little more concrete, one of the largest findings from behavioral science is that human beings tend to have two systems or families of cognitive operations in their minds. They are charmingly called System 1 and System 2. System 1 is automatic and effortless and fast. If I brought a large dog onto the podium with me, some of you would be immediately fearful and others amused. The immediate reaction would be followed by some sort of deliberative judgment about what the animal's there for. If the stock market is going down, some people have an automatic reaction that the economy is collapsing. Then there's a more deliberative and calculative judgment. A striking demonstration of the distinction between System 1 and System 2 and the problem that System 1 can create from consumers is that a number of the errors that human beings make, that cognitive analysts have identified, disappear when people are speaking in a foreign language. So if I tried un peu de français, seulement un peu, I'd probably make fewer errors than I'm about to. And the reason is that when people speak in a foreign language, their intuitions are disabled. Their System 1 isn't working. Their System 2 is in charge. When people are working in a language that's their own, intuitive thinking is at the fore. Deliberative judgments are often chastised by the intuition that a native speaker is using. When you're in a foreign language, you're working really hard. And that can be an advantage in the sense that your intuitions aren't operating. I think that provides some lessons about consumer behavior and behavior that involves the environment. Okay, here are just three concepts. The simplest is the third. Complexity is really harmful. Choice architecture just means all of our choices have an architecture behind them. For cell phone plans, rental cars, environmental programs, interactions with small business, there's an architecture there. The idea of a nudge, which could have been a book you never would have heard of called Libertarian Paternalism, that was our original title. The idea is that often you can influence people's choices, but allow them to go in the direction that they see fit. So the idea behind libertarianism is preserve freedom of choice in a democratic nation. Allow people to go their own way, but give them a little help. A canonical example of a libertarian paternalist effort is a GPS, which allows people to go the direction they want. They can ignore it, but it gives them a sense of how they can get in the direction they want if they want to do so efficiently. Okay, concrete lessons from behavioral science about what nudges and other interventions might do. Make things, if you can, automatic. An example, by the way, in terms of the problem of people being unbanked, as it's called, a problem that many nations face. One intervention that could be tried is financial education and literacy. That could help. Here's another one. Mail people a debit card in which they have some resources maybe that they're owed by government. Then they're banked automatically. The United States has tried that with considerable success, banking the unbanked by giving them a debit card, which operates as the equivalent of a bank account. Keep things intuitive, make them meaningful, avoid comparison friction. That is, there's a lot of data suggesting that if you provide people with information about something important, whether it involves healthcare or energy or cell phone usage or anything that has economic consequences for them, they're not going to be able to handle it very well unless you give them a context in which they can compare it with some other opportunity. If they can't do that automatically, if it takes them some work, comparison friction will defeat them. And it's very important to find ways to enable consumers easily to overcome comparison friction. If you're with me, the challenge is to figure out how your electricity bill would be better or worse if you tried something else, or how your credit or mortgage plan would be better or worse if you tried something else. If it's not easy to see the comparison, the friction will turn out to be a serious problem. Okay, what would regulators be interested in here? What would motivate them? One idea is that nudges can be much less expensive for the private and public sectors alike. If you're interested in consumer welfare or a healthier population, often the nudge approach is very cheap. It doesn't require taxpayer resources, and it doesn't impose a regulatory burden on the private sector. They can be effective, and they emphatically respect freedom of choice. So that's the promise of the approach. Okay, here's the American model, and I'm going to tell you a little bit institutionally here, as some of the earlier remarks signaled the importance of. I was, I'll tell you, you want to hear about my first date with my wife? I'm going to tell you about my first date with my wife. We both worked on, she's the United States ambassador to the United Nations now and in the president's cabinet, Samantha Power. You may see her on television. On our first date, we were both working for the Obama campaign. And she asked me, if you could have any job other than being a law professor, she knew I was very happy as a law professor. If you could have any job, what it would be. And I said, I would like to head the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. I almost lost the opportunity for a second date. I learned subsequently that she was hoping I would say I'd play on the United States World Cup team or guitar with Bruce Springsteen. The reason I gave the answer I did is this office, created by President Reagan, has a unique role in the sense that it oversees all of national regulation. It has the authority to veto regulations. So if the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Transportation or the Department of Health and Human Services wants to go forward with a regulation, that office, subject to the president's ultimate control, has the authority to veto regulations. It works closely with the private sector. It engages the private sector to think whether a regulatory solution is helpful or not. It works to improve regulations by virtue of the fact that it has a formal veto authority. There is a nudge unit in the United Kingdom. There's now something kind of like this in the United States as well. But there's particular value in an institution that has centralized oversight capacity with the authority and the expertise to make its will decisive. Now, I worked very much under the direct guidance of the President of the United States. I knew what he wanted. And that gave me, some clarity about what I was supposed to be doing. But if the role had been advisory or consultative, it would have been much weaker. And if it had operated as the equivalent of a think tank, as I know some institutions do, it might have been ignored. That's the American model. Here are some American nudges that emerge from the last few years. There's a credit card law we enacted in 2009, which is basically designed to protect consumers from practices which may be formally deceptive or may instead be like bad cockpits. Okay, so that's what the credit card law does. It has a series of nudges in it, including simple disclosure requirements. We now know that the credit card law is saving American consumers $20 billion annually. That's an extraordinary number, and a good feature of it is that the benefits are concentrated among people who have bad credit ratings, meaning consumers who are struggling. They are the principal beneficiaries of this nudge-pervaded law. Our financial reform law, which you may have heard of, Dodd-Frank it's called, it has an idea in it in the consumer protection world called know before you owe. That's in a way an idea about financial education made very simple. And one of the drivers of the policy is to make sure that people have knowledge before they get into debt. Our healthcare law is controversial in many ways, but it has a series of disclosure requirements which are designed to make markets work better. Childhood obesity problem, which First Lady Michelle Obama is very concerned about, the solution lies in better choice architecture so that people have healthy, low-calorie foods readily available and aren't seeing unhealthy, fatty foods as soon as they get in stores. Okay, for energy efficiency, here are just 3 ideas for implementation. Clear, simple disclosure allowing consumers to make comparisons. That can make a big difference. A second is to design regulatory standards in a way that's attentive to behavioral market failures as well as standard market failures. By this I mean sometimes consumers don't buy energy efficient products because they are focused on upfront costs, not future savings. And a standard that includes the economic savings over time has a solid economic justification. The third idea is the immense importance of cost-benefit analysis as part of the kind of constitutional fabric of regulatory judgment. And while the idea of cost-benefit analysis doesn't tend to get people's blood flowing with excitement, it is massively important as a way of ensuring against regulatory overreach or regulatory neglect. Okay, here's our old fuel economy label in the United States, and this is just an American illustration, but I hope it will drive home the idea of poor cockpit design in the area of disclosure. If you're a consumer, this doesn't tell you anything that's meaningful. MPG means miles per gallon. 23 versus 30, what does that mean? If you're concerned about the environment or about the economics, you have very little clarity. If you have terrific eyesight, you might be able to see at the bottom, middle, estimated annual fuel cost. That is meaningful and important for consumers, but it's so tiny that they can barely see it, and it's certainly not emphasized. Here's the new one. The new one gives 2 bits of information that are really important. One is it says you're going to save, or if it's a fuel inefficient car, you're going to spend a certain amount of money over the next 5 years. So it maps onto people's decisions the economic cost of the product, and it has annual fuel cost in very vivid, clear letters in the left-hand side. If you're concerned about the environment, it gives you some information about that too. though admittedly you have to work a little hard to find that. Okay, here are some concrete nudges for consumers. I'll just give a story here, and I'm hoping you'll be able to think of analogies. In the United States, many people were shocked by their phone bills to find that they'd gone over and they had to pay more, overcharges. It's called bill shock. The problem is people didn't have warnings. So our Federal Trade Commission our Federal Communications Commission proposed a rule that would require the companies to notify people by text message when they're about to go over. The effect of the proposal of the rule was that the companies got together and said, we're going to send those reminders out voluntarily. And the consequence is people aren't, through neglect or inadvertence, failing to pay. One idea is to ask people to make active choices in contexts in which inertia is getting the better of them. So if it's the case that consumers are stuck with a product that they're not changing from, but it's in their economic interest to change, to tell them you're going to have to make a choice now in order to keep getting the product, that can pay big, big dividends. So to think of ways to get people out of a default which persists over long periods of time through requiring active choosing, that can be super helpful for consumers. I'm going to say a bit soon about smart disclosure as a consumer protection device. Just keep it in mind if you would. Okay, if you remember any slide of these, I hope is this one. So this is the one I'm hoping you will not forget, at least not tomorrow. Maybe the day after, but try to remember it. In Denmark, automatic enrollment in savings plans has a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives. Now that's a stunning finding because both of its components ought not to be true. In fact, Nobel Prizes have been awarded to people who say neither of the components can be true. Automatic enrollment ought not to be very powerful because people can opt out like that. It's easy opt-out. Nonetheless, automatic enrollment is massively successful in increasing savings. Significant tax incentives have had only a modest effect. That's because they're not salient, and so people don't take advantage of them. Now, whether or not this particular application has relevance here, I hope you'll keep the example in mind because automatic enrollment costs essentially nothing to taxpayers. Significant tax incentives cost a lot, and it's the cheap policy that has a bigger impact. A homely analogy, if you want to save money by reducing paper use, and that's environmentally good also, change the default rule on people's printers from single-sided to double-sided. That has a big impact, decreases paper use by 10%. By contrast, a 10% tax on paper use decreases paper use by 2%. The cheap one is the more effective. There's a company now that is having some international success called O-Power, which mails people a home energy report which tells people how their energy use compares to that of their neighbors. Short report. You can see how your energy, whether you're using more or less. That home energy report, very simple and short, has the same effect in reducing energy consumption as an 8 to 20% increase in the short-term price of electricity. Third finding, we have a program in the United States to give people financial aid so that they can go to college. It's a pretty complicated form. It has over 100 questions. Simplification of the form has the same impact in getting people to attend college as a several $1,000s increase in the subsidy. If you're trying to save money and get people to college, simplifying the form is a lot more attractive than giving people thousands of dollars more. That's that slide. That's my favorite slide. Okay, what is a nudge? A GPS is, also this little elephant is being nudged. Here's a nudge done by academics, which is now being used by the private sector in the United States, the financial sector, in fact. The study shows that youngish people don't save for retirement under many circumstances. They don't save enough. But if they are aged by a computer to see themselves when they're older, and then they're asked whether they want to save for retirement, they start saving more. And the reason is that their future self becomes real rather than an abstraction. There's a large bank in the United States which is using this now with success in getting people to start saving for retirement. It's a nudge because it makes their future self no longer a stranger. Here's the old United States Department of Agriculture food pyramid, which was how we tried to encourage people to eat healthy foods. You see a person, gender unclear, you can't tell if that's a man or a woman, walking to the top of a pyramid. The top is a little triangle. You see the little triangle at the top? Is that death? Is that thinness? It's unclear. The foods at the bottom, I think, are unrecognizable as foods. There's only one thing that is recognizable. I think on the lower right, if you look carefully, it seems to be a shoe. Does that mean one should eat a shoe? This is an example of a failed disclosure policy because of its complexity. Here's what we replaced it with: a new food plate, which says make half your plate fruit and vegetables, and then you'll be fine. It replaces a complicated, unintelligible nudge with a simple, clear nudge. Automatic enrollment is a nudge. This is a savings example, but it could have been anything at all. And it shows if you automatically enroll people in a savings plan, participation rates more than double. There's a program in the United States which gives poor children access to breakfast and lunch. That's a good program. It has widespread support. A lot of poor children aren't in the program because it's too complicated to figure out how to get in. We changed the default rule so they're automatically in if we have information such that we know they deserve to be in. And the result is to give millions of children meals to which they're entitled and which they otherwise wouldn't be getting. Many people stay in under opt-out, even if the costs of change are very low, which means default rules really matter. I know there's a lot of interest here in energy. I'll tell you a little example from Germany, which is stunning to me. Before Germany's energy transition, large numbers of Germans said that they wanted clean energy and would choose it. But in almost every place in Germany, the percentage of people who chose green energy or had green energy was tiny, 5% or less. Except for two communities in Germany, just two. Two had very high rates, over 90% of clean energy. Why? You might think that in those communities in Germany, there's an active green movement. There's a lot of environmental education. You might think that there's an interest group that pushed green energy. None of these would be true. It's just by serendipity, two communities had green energy defaults, and consumers had to switch to something else. And even though switching to something else would save people money, they didn't switch. The default turned out to be decisive. So for energy policy, the question is, when is a good default environmentally preferred? Or if that seems too aggressive, when might we use active choosing to get people to make self-conscious decisions about what kind of energy they want? Simplification, we know, is a nudge. And one thing that the Obama administration is very focused on, it was a big part of my job, is to ask all parts of the government to simplify the requirements they now impose, especially insofar as they affect small businesses and participants in national programs. I think that's something many democracies should be focused on. I've worked a little bit with developing countries, and they know that some of the problems their citizens face are a product of complexity. Social norms are nudges. One way to increase tax compliance is to notify people who are not paying their taxes that they're in the minority. That has a big impact. One way to reduce abuse of alcohol and drugs is, if it's true, to notify people who are abusing alcohol and drugs that they're in a small minority of the relevant group. If you can notify people that they are in deviating from their peers, it's possible to get their behavior in a direction that's better for them. Okay, I promised I'd say something about smart disclosure, and I'm going to redeem that promise right now. The idea is to make sure that consumers get information that companies have about consumers' own choices. Whether the issue involves energy or healthcare or credit cards or anything else, it should be easy for consumers to get access to information about what they did last year or the year before in machine-readable, downloadable formats. The United Kingdom has enacted a law now, I think it's called the My Data law, that does this, and it's pretty straightforward to do. Okay, the ethics of nudging. There are some concerns about manipulation. The best response is to ensure full transparency and democratic accountability. Nudging is inevitable, and nudges preserve freedom of choice. The safeguard against bad nudges is to make sure everybody knows what they are, to make sure that nothing is kept secret. There are limits of nudging, and they are reflected in the GPS example. Notice, if you would, the GPS illustration has two pleasing features. One is its means paternalism rather than ends paternalism. You're not asking people to go in directions they don't want to go. You're helping them to get to their preferred location. So it's a paternalism of means, not a paternalism of ends. And notice also that there's no ban, that people can go in their own direction. Nudges are not just about resisting temptation. We can imagine illegitimate nudges, as in the idea you vote for the incumbent unless you indicate otherwise. That would be an anti-democratic default. But the problem there isn't that it's a nudge, is that the goal of the nudger is illicit. One way to cure that problem is to make sure that we're always focused on consumers or other people's own ends and not trying ends of their own. Nudging is not manipulative insofar as it's clear and transparent. And I hope the examples I gave avoid the charge of manipulation. Okay, I only have one other thing to tell you about. It's called the regulatory look back. What President Obama did in 2011 was to say to all parts of the federal government, all federal agencies, you have a bunch of rules on the books. Why don't you scrutinize them? Not just the flow of new rules, but also the stock of existing rules. Because it would be a remarkable coincidence if the existing stock of rules issued over a period of many years is wonderful. What resulted from that is over 500 reform proposals. They're saving over $13 billion over the next 5 years. Many of those costs will eventually be saved by businesses large and small and enjoyed by consumers as well. The basic idea is that this has to be done periodically, not just as a one-shot endeavor, to make sure that the government is scrutinizing its requirements. Okay, for future directions, just a few ideas. Everywhere that private and public institutions are engaging with consumers and businesses, greater simplification is a good idea. We need to increase empirical assessment of the consequences of what's done, and not to be defeated by the fact that it's frequently challenging to do that. The increasing empirical assessment should be understood as connected with my plea for cost-benefit analysis. Retrospective analysis of rules can be a way of saving money and promoting health, and using creative nudges both to do well for businesses and to do good for society. Okay, we have an expression in English. I hope every language has this expression, the tip of an iceberg. We're the tip of an iceberg. We only can see the top, but the iceberg itself is beautiful. Thanks.